Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier citizens forum. We're delighted you're with us today. I'm Don Williams, president of City Club. Our topic today is greening the city-state, creating the best regional park system in the world. Our speakers are columnist and author Neal Peirce and Metro President Paul Bragdon.
That's Paul Bragdon.
Oh, I'm sorry, David Bragdon. Sorry, that was... Sorry. For the benefit of our radio and television audience, please turn off your cell phone and other electronic devices. First, a few announcements. Join us next week when Governor Ted Kulongoski will give his State of the State address at the City Club Friday Forum. One of the front page stories on the Oregonian this week had a caption saying, "Oregon, serving voters a hot political buffet." Well, City Club Friday Forums will be a wonderful opportunity for you to test the menu of that buffet. Hosting candidates and debates and forums is central to the City Club mission of informing the community about public affairs. Over the next 2 months, we're going to be hosting 6 debates, and candidates from federal, state, and City of Portland offices will be in the spotlight. You can also suggest a research topic. The Research Board of City Club is now considering topics for our next long-range study. You can help. Submit your idea on the cards at your tables and return it to the City Club staff member. Today, we also launch our spring membership drive. Our goal this year is to add 100 new members, and we need your help to do this. There's also such a thing as a free lunch. If you recommend a new member, you will get a free lunch to Friday Forum, as will the new member. Contact Kim at the back of the room for details. We wouldn't be able to have these great City Club Friday Forums if it weren't for our good corporate sponsors, and we'd like to thank them for their support and generosity. Please join me in thanking our sponsors, KeyBank, the law firm of Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt, and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Architects, LLP. We're honored to have journalist and author Neal Peirce lead off our discussion today. Listen to this quote from a speech he gave a number of years ago in Washington, D.C., and you'll find out why it's appropriate for him to talk to City Club, and it's a great example of his position on civic engagement. In this speech, he described the characteristics of metropolitan regions, the traits that will give them the cohesiveness to both survive and thrive in the 21st century. Mr. Peirce said, "The region should have strong organizations for citizen leadership. The broader point here is that the civic support networks, including networks of citizens organizations, community leadership organizations, and neighborhoods and suburban groups should all be part of the dialogue." Well, today, you will have a chance to be part of that dialogue. Neal Peirce is a syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group. He is founder and contributing editor of the National Journal. In 1975, he began, and continues today, the United States' first national column on state and local government's themes. His 10-book series on American states and regions culminated in The Book of America, Inside 50 States Today. The director of the Rockefeller Institute of Government said, "No one in the country knows as much as Neal Peirce about the ins and outs of American local governments and cities." He's also been described as the foremost writer among American journalists on metropolitan regions. Neal and 2 of his colleagues coined the term city-states. He'll tell us about that concept today and how city-states such as the Portland metro area can harness civic forces to promote both livability and sustainability. And before our speakers begin, we'd also like to express our sincere appreciation to Mike Hauk, the Urban Greenpeace Institute, and Metro for bringing Neal Peirce to Portland and to City Club.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Williams. I'm delighted to be with you today. I always like to come back to Portland. I'm always hoping I might catch a glimpse of Mount Hood, but I've been... You guys hide it pretty well. Actually, Mike Houck had promised me a bike ride, and instead it's raining hard the last 2 days. But there's lots to like here. I like your streetscapes. I love your delightful sculptures and fountains. I admire your light rail and streetcars, which were but a twinkling of possibility when I did my first professional interviews here in the summer of 1969 and interviewed some legal aid lawyer in a crowded little North Portland office who told me that transportation was necessary for this city to get its Transportation Act together. You may know who that person was. I like Portland, too, because of its elected metro government. It's the only elected metropolitan government in the United States. Why? Because regions are, as Mr. Williams suggested, I would say, and I will repeat, where it is in our modern world. I did figure that out by the early 90s, working with colleagues on a series of reports on metropolitan regions. It became pretty clear to us. We wrote a book called Citistates, and our argument was that each region is its own combined and jointly shared work pool, commute shed, media and medical, higher university, education market, environmentally joined, air and water pollution, all those other issues. And from an airplane, if you look down onto any metropolitan region, you don't see all the political boundaries. So it's an organic thing, or in economic terms, we've said the city-state is what the economy does. Now, some of my friends at the famed Brookings Institution, which used to just be interested in Washington, D.C., changed their minds this year, and they say it's time that we have a new mental map, away from 50 states, so they're still there and important, but now on to the nation's 363 metropolitan regions, because those, especially the 100 largest among them, are the heartbeat of America, our economic muscle, our wellsprings of innovation and high skills. This is where you find the advanced research and development, our ability to compete in a pretty toughly competitive new global economy. Top 100 metros of the country, for example, have 65% of our people, but they account for 74% of our gross domestic product and even more of our high-skilled jobs. Metros are not just part of the national economy, the Brookings folks are arguing. They are the national economy. America is a metropolitan nation. So finally, what some of us regionalists were writing about for years is recognized. But there's another way to make the case, that a new American narrative is forming and regions and great cities are where it is. First, you have to say, let's look back. We had a 21st century of Americans doing a strange thing. For the first time in the 5 millennia of cities, they went away from the center out to the periphery. And the reasons go beyond, I think, our love of the private car and our instinct for our own house with a white picket fence. We were able to go suburban because we were responding to big market signals. Most important of all, probably, cheap energy, but then cheap land, tremendous government wealth, willingness to spend that government money on mega highways and government-subsidized mortgages for suburban development. It was a time of steadily rising family incomes. Ordinary guy could make cool wages on an assembly line, buy a house and maybe a boat, and even have enough money left over to send a kid or two to college. Plus the high competency then in our core industries. At the end of World War II, we had 45% of the world's manufacturing capacity for a year or two. We were way ahead. But in this century, some new market signals. They've flipped in a way. Oil soared past $110 a barrel, I believe, yesterday. I don't know if it's still there, or maybe the day before. With China and India competing with us, petroleum prices are probably up for good. And with that, by the way, costs of steel and cement for building. Food, once remarkably cheap in America, is getting expensive, partly because of our misguided ethanol effort and the price of corn rising. Water emergencies, possibly driven by climate change, are spreading ominously. Land is no longer cheap. The stock market needs big stimulus shocks from the Fed to prevent free fall. Government wealth is way down. Its debt, at least the national debt, at stratospheric levels. Real family incomes for many people static or in peril of going down. In contrast to the era of the GI Bill and sort of we could afford and we will have prosperity and opportunity for everybody, college has started to cost a prohibitive arm and a leg. Our national support for scientific research is certainly not where it should be against foreign competition, and many of our industries are slipping in world-leading competencies, and you look to new technologies like solar, and you see it being developed first in Japan, Germany, other places, but not here. So how do we get out of such messes? No silver bullet. But if you want to find the strong cut at solutions, check our cities and regions. The era of super roads is ending, except for some toll roads and in Texas. We're laying down more streetcar and light rail track now in this country than any time in the last century. Some 75% of transit referenda are passing, and that includes a raft of southern and western cities which we thought would never get into this kind of thing. Places like Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Sacramento, Seattle, St. Louis, Charlotte. The list goes on and on. Even Houston is building light rail. We've been passing all sorts of referenda to protect open space. By one count, we're saving more each year than is falling into development, quite a switch. Great new urban parks are opening in such cities as Atlanta and Chicago. Urban crime has declined dramatically. Young professionals are flocking into center cities, plus empty nesters tired of the crabgrass. Farmers markets in cities are expanding, so are arts and theater and waterfront expansions. It's a really historic revival of the American city. The number of city-statewide alliances, business and nonprofits working together to further the fortunes of regions has ballooned in the last years. Almost all of them are nonpartisan, not caught up in our rather cloying political battles. And who was first in trying to face up to climate change, which is likely to be the most critical, dangerous phenomenon of our age? Portland, with its plan in the early 90s, makes that claim. But now, as the federal government drags its heels, 700-plus cities are at least promising to try and meet the Kyoto standards. So what we need, in short, is a nation and states that listen more carefully and work more closely with the solution fields of our times, the cities and regions. Now, today's topic is parks. Last evening, I had an opportunity to speak to the Portland Parks and Recreation Dinner. I was able to talk about how incredibly fortunate you are from an outsider's view to have your Metropolitan Green Spaces Master Plan that Metro adopted back in 1992, a couple of very successful ballot measures, the presence of a meaningful urban growth boundary, and now the major Connecting Green initiative that David Bragdon is pushing, and I'm sure will describe for you very well in a few minutes. And how in developing transit-oriented nodes of development, you're inviting the kind of dense housing and retail that can absorb lots of people and activity, but with a need for parks near those nodes so that people will be drawn to them and we can curb some of our sprawling habits, which are simply not going to be affordable or practical in this century. But there's an irony. Most of America believes that you in Portland live in some kind of tightly packed urban growth boundaries. You can't get out. You're all forced together in this very uncomfortable density. But I was exposed to some recent figures that suggest that's not so. The national figures on city density, which measure people per acre, Portland ranks in an intermediate low category of density, along with the likes of Fresno, Las Vegas, and Atlanta. Your figure is 6.2 people an acre compared to Seattle at just under 11, or Los Angeles at just under 13, or Chicago at almost 20. So you clearly have a ways to go in building the densities that will be critical for truly successful cities and regions in this century. You will need to think about complementing or completing the still to be fulfilled 19.3 proposal of the Olmsted brothers for a system of connected parks here. You'll need to think region-wide and by state on a lot of parks fronts, including Portland east of the river and lagging unincorporated county areas like Park Rose and Gateway and Bull Mountain, which were built in the years after World War II when parks were not valued, only private yards. Parks today aren't alone, they stand for much more. Nearby spots of green lungs, natural settings, pathway corridors that allow wildlife and plant species to move from one to another, inducements to walking and bicycling to resist our national growing obesity epidemic, accessible community schools that kids can reach on their own 2 feet or cycles. Also, the need to keep some park areas wild and natural so that kids can relate directly to the environment, a theme that my colleague Rich Liu advanced in his recent bestseller, Last Child in the Woods, about what he calls young people's nature deficit disorder. Read the book, it's great. In Mike Houck, you have one of America's foremost advocates for keeping the natural order alive within cities and suburbs, and insisting that natural values are critical on this side, not just the other side of the urban growth boundary. But don't consider Mike an outlier. Anne Whiston Spirn wrote a seminal book in 1984, The Granite Garden, in which she rejected the idea, then pretty popular, that the natural world begins outside the city. The city is city, it's all concrete. Out there is where the natural world begins. Nature in the city, she wrote, must be cultivated like a garden rather than ignored or subdued. Another favorite of mine is Rutherford Platt, who wrote a book published last year, The Humane Metropolis. He talks about cities and communities that are an interconnected web of green and health and sociability and civic spirit and inclusivity, protecting and restoring natural systems, combining themes of humanity and nature. But none of this works unless you can think about the true city, in your case, your entire 2-state metropolitan region. Wonderful steps forward like your Pearl area and its handsome new parks, which I saw and admired hugely on a tour yesterday, or the alternative development form of the rather amazing high-rise South Waterfront project. And what a treat it was to look down from the 37th floor of one of those new gold platinum LEED rated buildings to see through Mike Houck's telescope right down onto Ross Island and from the top into the blue heron nests and watch them moving around and having a grand time together. Progress, parks, nature in harmony, critical steps in an imperiled century. But as far as you have come on such fronts, where do you need to progress? You do need to progress region-wide in a consistent way, from community gardens to great signature parks, from new blue-green water conserving steps to a bike roadway infrastructure that leads the nation. On these and other fronts, the question is what next? No outsider knows, but I understand you're going to be hearing that after yet another introduction. Thank you all.
David Bragdon was first elected to the Metro Council in 1998. He became Metro's first regionally elected president in 2003, and his second term began in 2007. Prior to his public service at Metro, David built a successful career and worked for Nike, Lasco Shipping, and traveled around the world for Evergreen Airlines. David also served as a marine marketing manager for the Port of Portland for 5 years. Oregonians like their elected officials to work hard and also have a commitment to public service. David exemplifies this ethic. When elected to the Metro Council, he supplemented his part-time position by driving a cab for Broadway Cab. David was born in New York. He grew up in Portland. He attended Catlin Gable School and then graduated from Harvard with honors in 1982. David is a sports fan, and finally, David and his dad, Paul, who's not our speaker, but is sitting at that table down there, attended the first game the New York Mets played in Shea Stadium. And they're going to return to Shea this fall to see the last game in Shea Stadium before it's demolished. David, welcome.
Thank you. Well, I knew coming in I was at a disadvantage and had a tough act to follow with following Neal Peirce here, but I did not know that my dad was going to be billed as the speaker, and so I actually think we ought to let my mom do it. What do you think about that? That would probably be the best that you could have here today. But I'll give it a try here, and I'm going to follow some of what Neal talked about today as well as last night. And he talked about what's happening with parks across this country and in other places, as well as what's happening here. And I start by thinking about what are the things that we have here and what are some of the gifts that we have compared to some of the other places that Neal gets to visit, what we start with. What we start with is a metropolis that is in a remarkable natural setting. We're surrounded by mountains. We're not far from the beach. Our area is laced with rivers and streams. And even in the urban parts of our region, in fact, to some extent, when you talk about Northwest Portland vis-a-vis Forest Park, especially in the most urban parts of our region, we do show that we can coexist with trees and little canyons and forested buttes. We have a lot going for us here. And when you look around the room here, you realize we have a tremendous amount of human resources in this region here. We have people who really care about this place and who have an ethic about really taking care of it. Our economy also features companies that lead the world in designing and marketing products that people elsewhere all over the world use to enjoy the outdoors. So it's an important, significant part, not just of our way of life, but our economy. These are all great advantages that we have. They're advantages primarily that we inherited. We inherited either from earlier generations or we inherited from nature itself. But when you look at those advantages in a strategic context vis-a-vis other parts of the world, those are primary strategic advantages that we have now, that other metropolitan regions around the world ought to be envious of, and that we ought to be making the most of. And that's what it's about. It's about what we do here and in the future, to make the most of what we have. It's not about being smug about what it is that nature gave us or what previous generations have left us. The test really is what we do with it now. And as we heard from Neal last night, a little bit today, other metropolises around this country are making far fewer natural gifts than we have. Chicago has been mentioned, but Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis, New York City, even Atlanta, that we like to fancy ourselves as being vastly superior to. Successful regions like that all over this country are recognizing the value of investing in and expanding their parks. And they're doing it in a very bold way. They're doing it in a very significant way financially. They're investing much more boldly than we are. And they're also measuring the considerable return on investment and using return on investment broadly construed to measure the value of that investment. They are seeing that return on investment in terms of reduced heart disease or reduced respiratory disease. They're seeing it in terms of reduced childhood obesity and the general health of the population. They see the return on investment in terms of the clean water that we and the other species that share this space depend on, or the clean air that we all do. Now, all those regions are progressing not because nature gave them more than nature gave us. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Nature gave us a lot more than nature gave most of those other places. But they're progressing because their economic and social and political systems have different circumstances and different expectations than we do. The major difference, and we had Mayor Daley here to speak last summer and talk about Millennium Park and the other things that they're doing in Chicago. And when you listen to what they're doing, the fundamental social and economic and political difference is that successful regions like Chicago play to win. And they play to win by adding to what nature gave them and enhancing it. They play to win, while all too often we Oregonians simply play hoping not to lose what we have. That, to me, is the fundamental challenge of all of this. It's about raising our expectations, not being smug about what we inherited, but making the most and taking it to the very next level. And not playing to win this competitive game, not just hoping we don't lose the great gifts that we already have. If we do that, if we raise our expectations, we are remarkably positioned, like nobody else in this country, to achieve something that's pretty simple and pretty astonishing all at the same time. And what we are positioned to accomplish is to have the best network of parks and natural areas and trails in the world. All we need to do, it is simple but tough at the same time, all we need to do is leverage the gifts that we have, organize ourselves a little bit more intentionally, work together better, and be willing to spend more, or at least to spend more strategically than we currently do. Let's start a little bit with an inventory of the gifts that we have. We've got hills and buttes with views in all directions, 855 miles of rivers and streams that course through our region, trees that grow taller than Admiral Nelson's statue in Trafalgar Square, more than 75 extinct volcanoes, at least we think they're extinct, in our region, thousands of picnic tables, several of the most significant international public gardens in the entire world are in our region, when you think about the public gardens that we have. 333 picnic tables around the region. We have a nationally acclaimed arboretum that has a living collection of trees from around the globe. These are very significant resources that we've invested in. We have other assets here that we haven't necessarily invested in, but that we're very lucky to have. Gifts like the Tualatin River or the view of Mount Hood. Believe me, it's there. Come back in August. That's something of tangible value. The osprey who had breakfast in the Sandy River Delta right near downtown Troutdale this morning and who is having lunch at Oaks Bottom right now while we're sitting here in the Governor Hotel just a couple of miles away having our own lunch, that's a gift for our region. The steelhead that rested overnight also right around Ross Island, right now that steelhead is actually moving up to Oregon City because he doesn't want to meet the osprey for lunch. But again, it's a gift for our region. Moving back to things that we have built, we also have the only public plaza in America, and the significance of public plazas for urban vitality shouldn't be underestimated. We have the only one in the country, and it's in Hillsboro, Oregon, that has a LEED certified gold city hall on one side of it and century-old giant sequoia trees on the other. There's no place else you can go and see something like that combination of a LEED gold city hall and 100-year-old trees. So those are lots of gifts that we have. In the region overall, we have over 60,000 acres of land that's owned by the public. It's in the hands of local governments, special districts, ourselves, regional governments, state and federal governments, but really all those lands are owned by you, and they're really remarkable assets. But we're not always doing our best by those assets, and biologists will say that more than half of that public land today is degraded in one way or another. It's deferred maintenance, invasive species. In fact, they will say that perhaps up to 10% of Forest Park is literally being strangled by ivy, 10% being about 500 acres of Forest Park in terms of invasive species, and just plain old overuse or eroding the value of that multi-billion-dollar asset base that we have here. Yet even as some of our best-loved parks are being almost loved to death, 4 in 10 of our region's residents, particularly those in the suburban areas which developed in the second half of the 20th century when shopping mall parking lots were considered to be the only civic space that anybody ever really deserved, 4 in 10 of people in this region now do not live within safe walking distance of a simple neighborhood park. And again, that's particularly in the suburban areas or places that have developed more recently. To me, it is astonishing to think that people can live in a place like Oregon and not be within walking distance of a neighborhood park. But in fact, that is the case for 4 in 10. This is like living in a town in Ireland and not being within walking distance of a pub. What is the point of living in Oregon if you can't be near a park? What's the point of living in a town in Ireland if you're not within walking distance of a pub? It boggles the imagination that that's possible. In terms of those bolder urban parks, the versions of things that Mayor Daley talked about with regard to Millennium Park, our deficit in that regard is even greater. That Hillsboro Plaza that I described is still unfortunately a rarity. And Hillsboro, Lake Oswego, Portland, Vancouver, Washington are still exceptional in our region in having built a public gathering place in their historic downtown. But now Tigard, Milwaukee, Oregon City, Gresham, other communities now have aspirations to do similar distinctive parks in their downtowns, but they lack the funds and the financial tools to actually carry those out. So it's an old cycle. It's not something new in Oregon, an old cycle of promise and also falling short. The Olmsteds were here in 1903, defined a great vision, led to a plan for a trails network, among other things. That trails network is now envisioned to someday total 900 miles. But in the more than 100 years of some days since then, we've built 194 miles. And it'd be more than 100 years before we complete that if we keep going at the pace we're going. Footnote to the story is that not long after the Olmsteds left town, voters rejected some of the funding for their plan, and so that's why some of it didn't come true. So there are promises, there's redemption of promises, there's good news, and then there's the potential for follow-through. That's what we're working on now, because in 2006, the Metro Council's voters approved $227 million for the acquisitions of natural areas and trails, as well as local projects all over the region. Just this week, the Portland City Council, and hats off to them, they increased fees on new development so that Parks capital funds can keep pace or hope to catch up to demand. We have success stories all over the region. Tualatin Hills Park and Recreation District in and around Beaverton regularly wins awards, national awards for top management practices in first-class facilities. So I'm not here to talk about a crisis. I'm here to talk about an opportunity, or potentially foregone opportunities, and how to pull all those pieces together and how to go from good to great and being everything we can be. And that's where what I call Connecting Green comes in. Now, Connecting Green is not an organization, or Connecting Green is not a plan. Connecting Green is just a way of doing things, and that's what we're proposing. It's a way of doing things, of making all the things that we are already doing add up to more than the sum of the parts, and then doing a little bit more. We already have a lot of great organizations, nonprofits, and agencies all over the region. They're all doing good work, and that's part of the point, is how do we connect them all up, make them add up to more than the sum of the parts. Political boundaries, agencies, acronyms abound all around our region, and all of them play some role in our parks and natural areas. USF&W, THPRD, PPNR, WES, BLM, ODF&W, ODOT, CWS, ODOT, ORPA. Did I say ODOT twice? We need to get them thinking about parks. We need to get them thinking about bicycle transportation. Well, all those acronyms, they may all be doing good work, but we're not particularly coordinated or necessarily all that rational in how we go about it. The regional government, that's us, the Metro Council, operates some parks, but only in the far eastern part of the region, Oxbow and Blue Lake, paid for by a garbage tax on the whole region. So the regional government is not truly a regional provider, and in fact, maybe we shouldn't be a provider at all. Meantime, the most truly regional park of all, Forest Park, is run by our smallest unit of government, a municipality, Portland, whose unwittingly generous taxpayers provide that free park to thousands and thousands of users who come from unincorporated areas just outside the city limits without paying a dime for it. Our biggest unit of government of all here, the state, runs only 2 small state parks, maybe amount to a couple hundred acres in our whole region, even though 40% of the state's taxpayers live here in the metropolitan region. So basically, we've got the state government running a couple of what are basically neighborhood parks, and we've got a city government which is running what is basically a regional park, Forest Park, for 40% of the state's population. Now, these are sort of arcane and irrational bureaucratic arrangements. They may not matter to a whole lot of people or to the average person on the street, but it seems to me that an organizational expert would look at this situation and say, you know, there are probably some geographic inequities in here that also may relate to those 4 in 10 people who don't have access at all, and inefficiencies or unrealized efficiencies in how we're doing things. Inequities and inefficiencies are part of what we're trying to rectify through an effort like Connecting Green. Because our public expenditures or investments today are actually pretty fragmented, and they're very rarely leveraged and matched with one another, and that's what we're looking for through Connecting Green, is how do we match and connect and leverage one another's funds. When you pay your property taxes, you're contributing to about $159 million that gets spent on parks maintenance cumulatively around the region on operations. That is actually leading to more and more deferred maintenance, that property tax source being capped the way it is. And in general, as I mentioned before, the unincorporated areas tend to pay less, yet their residents come into cities and use city parks, again, without even knowing the difference. There are a lot of other varied flows of money that are also uncoordinated. When you pay your sewer bill in Beaverton or Tigard, elsewhere in the Tualatin Valley, some of that money ends up in an excellent tree planting and stream restoration program administered by Clean Water Services, which is the surface water management and sewage agency in the Tualatin Basin. Or when developers in most incorporated cities obtain building permits, they also pay system development charges that pay for parks improvements. When you buy a lottery ticket, some of the pennies of that end up going to state parks, and while actually most of it ends up in other parts of the state rather than coming back here, some of it does go to state parks that we enjoy. When you pay your electric bill, there's a little bit in there that's actually going to the Bonneville Power Administration for salmon and riparian restoration that might occur along the Clackamas or Sandy River. Or it might not. It might actually be spent in Idaho, because guess what? We've never really talked with the Bonneville Power Administration about how our efforts and aspirations along the Clackamas and Sandy might actually be teamed up with what they would like to do there. That's the type of discussion that we're now having because of Connecting Green. Really, as these intermittent and various streams of public money, when they're these independent channels across the landscape, they rarely converge into a common watershed, so to speak. And Connecting Green, this way of doing things, this way of approaching the environment and parks and natural areas, Connecting Green is about trying to create those common channels and common understandings among the myriad of organizations that are already out there doing a good job, government and non-governmental organizations, government at all levels. Get them to collaborate voluntarily. This is not any kind of merger or mega organization at all, but just an attempt to get everybody together voluntarily and collaboratively make their independent actions and expenditures more mutually supportive of one another, and then ultimately supportive of what should be our shared goal, which is that creation of the greatest network of parks, natural areas, and trails in the world. Let me give you one tangible example that's surfaced in the 6 months or so that I and others in the parks field have been preaching this concept of Connecting Green. The example, it's one to build on, is the Springwater Trail, which is used by thousands of people. Literally multi-use. Commuters, people are using it to get to and from work who used to be driving their cars, recreationalists, seniors who are out for walks, or kids who are on inline skates or bikes. The route from the Hawthorne Bridge to Gresham was pieced together painstakingly over more than 15 years. 15 years, which is longer than it took then Governor Mark O. Hatfield to construct the entirety of what was then Interstate 80N all the way from Ontario to Portland, including hundreds of miles through the Columbia Gorge. On the Springwater, over that time, the cities of Portland and Milwaukee and Gresham, as well as ourselves on the Metro Council, all contributed financially to different segments at different times with different pots of money: bond measure money, federal transportation money, local money. This is a great model of cooperation, and it needs to literally go further, because though the OMSI to Selwood segment opened and usership boomed, when the 3 bridges were built across Johnson Creek and the railroad in McLaughlin, usership boomed even more. But in terms of going further, beyond Telford Road in Gresham, east of Gresham, it's terra incognita. Now, it's not terra incognita in that 14th century sense, because explorers don't know what's there. We actually do know what is beyond Gresham. It's terra incognita simply because of artificial jurisdictional lines. In fact, we do know what's there, and what's there in east of Gresham is very easily known and pretty damn spectacular, in fact. What extends beyond Telford Road is an abandoned railroad right-of-way, which is currently overgrown and nearly impassable. It leads through a deep primordial canyon. You would have no idea that you're near 1.5 million people, called Deep Canyon, which is now part of our acquisition target area. It emerges then a couple of hundred feet from the gates of Barton Park, which is on the Clackamas River. Now, that part of the right-of-way is already owned by the state of Oregon, and it's sitting there entirely unused, disused, really unusable. From Barton, it parallels the Clackamas River, and it passes within a stone's throw of various waterfront parcels along the Clackamas that are either owned by us or by the government of Clackamas County. And it continues on to the edge of the Mount Hood National Forest, which of course is owned by the federal government. But my point at the beginning is all of those lands are actually owned by you. And those of us in public service who have trust and manage those lands need to be working together to make all that usable for you. It's very easy to imagine when you talk about it this way, stitching all those different ownerships together to create the possibility that one day you would be able to get on a bike in Pioneer Courthouse Square, ride across the Hawthorne Bridge, and 2 hours later, pedal quietly into the glade of a completely non-motorized campground on the banks of the Clackamas River. It's easy to imagine when you describe it and look at it that way. It's also very plausible to imagine walking, hiking just a little bit further than that and quickly being enveloped by the National Forest and hiking further up that trail to a junction with the Pacific Crest Trail, where you could turn left and go to Canada, or at least to Timberline Lodge, or you could turn right and go to Mexico, or at least to Crater Lake. Now, is there another metropolitan region in the country or in the world that has the opportunity to create an experience like that? Chicago, can they create something like that? I don't think so. Can Peirce create something like that? I don't think so. Hello? No, this is a very, very rare opportunity. And the only obstacles to capitalizing on this type of opportunity are institutional and financial obstacles, not natural obstacles. And in fact, the financial challenges are actually quite modest compared to the price tag for other forms of urban infrastructure. Believe me, this is also part of urban infrastructure, but it's a relatively economical and affordable one with great return on investment. The project I'm describing isn't even all that complicated. If everybody would agree to make it happen, the governor and the legislature would need to get the Oregon Department of Transportation aligned with Oregon State Parks and in turn aligned with Clackamas County Parks and us regarding the parcels along the river. We'd all need to enlist the help of the U.S. Forest Service and the congressional delegation. That's all doable. Let me actually just make a parenthetical comment. By the way, believe it or not, despite being a metropolitan region that is adjacent to hundreds of thousands of acres of federal lands. We have U.S. Fish and Wildlife out along the Tualatin and BLM and Forest Service on the east. We're also interlaced with the activities of lots of federal agencies, ranging from the Corps of Engineers to the Bonneville Power Administration or FEMA with regard to flooding issues. Despite all of that presence and activity in our region has never given our congressional delegation a unified strategy for how we want our urban natural areas and recreation needs to interface with federal agencies. And that's one of the tasks that we're going to undertake with this Connecting Green Alliance is put together that type of unified list. It's worked for us with transportation. We need to make the same thing happen with natural resources. But back to the Springwater Trail. On the way to Mount Hood, we could also keep working with Portland General Electric Company on riparian restoration projects along the Clackamas. This is a partnership we already have. They have certain obligations as a generator of hydroelectricity. We have lands that need restoration. The partnership between Portland General Electric and ourselves is something that we can continue to expand out in that way. Or partnerships with nonprofits like the Trust for Public Land, which is often nimble enough to pull off real estate deals, public-spirited real estate deals, that the government can't make happen alone. So that's just one example of the type of thing we can accomplish. Connecting Green is a way of discovering those sorts of opportunities and getting all those agencies to get beyond our own turf and create the network needed to make things like this happen. That's only one example. I could stand here for hours and give you others. I could tell you about the City of Forest Grove's visionary Emerald Necklace strategy for trails that connect around Forest Grove and up to Vernonian Banks in the Coast Range. I could tell you about the City of Wilsonville's ideas about working with their school district and an educational school and upping the ante on childhood environmental education, which is something we want to also undertake with Connecting Green on a grade school that is next to 260 acres that we own as a park, which in turn is next to a new urbanist private development called Villebois. Again, a connection between education, recreation, health, and housing, all of that coming together. The point is when we start sharing our imaginations and our shared agendas and induce working relationships among different agencies, those possibilities are really unlimited. They're as unlimited as what nature gave us to begin with. Connecting Green really does begin and now ends with that, with what nature gave us and with the customer. Neither nature nor the customer recognize the arbitrary jurisdictional and institutional boundaries that tend to unnecessarily fascinate those of us in government. The customer is the taxpayer, and the taxpayer is paying not just local taxes, but also regional and state and federal taxes, and may not know the difference. All the taxpayer knows it's coming out of the same pocket. But the customer is also that family that heads out for a walk on Saturday morning around Forest Grove, not knowing, and as far as I'm concerned, really not needing to know the difference between land that we own through the Metro Bond Program or the land owned by Clean Water Services or the land owned by the city or the land owned by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Let's give that customer, that family that's out for a walk on Saturday, or for that matter, that customer that shows up from out of town in Pioneer Courthouse Square because they're here for a convention, let's give that customer a single map and a website that shows all the different parks and trails that we have, regardless of what agency owns and operates them. It's easily doable. Just as the Star Alliance brand in the airline industry enhances rather than compromises the distinctive brands of companies that are as varied as Lufthansa and United Airlines and Mexicana. These are all companies who have their distinct ways of doing things, separate identities, but they chose to work together where it makes sense under this alliance-type brand. So too, the brand of Connecting Green will add coherence and identity to our region's parks providers without diminishing their local autonomy or their ability to do things differently in Forest Grove than they do them in Gresham. But in communicating with the public better and more coherently and cohesively, whether communicating with them as taxpayers at the ballot box or as customers on Saturday morning, we make a compelling case for confidence in the system and the ability to grow it even further and develop it into this greatest network in the world. Why should we settle for less here? To settle for less really is squandering the gifts that we've received from nature and that we've received from earlier generations. We have those natural assets here in the region. We have the people here who care about it. We have the traditions of doing it. We just need to set that goal and work for it. In doing that, we will achieve having the best network of parks, trails, and natural areas in the world. Thank you.
Asking questions is a privilege of City Club membership. Please limit your question to 30 seconds or less. Our first question will be asked by board host Ron Paul.
David, we talked about playing to win. Neal, we talked about city-states, and we talked about parks. Some years ago in The Atlantic, Bruce Katz and Jennifer Bradley wrote an article entitled Metropolitanism that went beyond just talking about parks, talked about education, talked about transportation, and talked about public works. Using the metaphors that we've discussed with parks, what are the political barriers to our truly thinking about a metropolitanism that Portland has the advantage already, in the same way that you mentioned the advantage of the natural scape, we have already the advantage of metropolitan regional government. Can we fulfill more of the imperatives in areas beyond parks, and what are the barriers to doing that?
Is that for me or you?
I'm sure you can answer that better than me, David. It's a sort of a local question. I think he was focusing on this region.
Sure. I think one of the probably the most important thing to overcome is parochialism and recognizing the true interdependence that actually exists in any metropolitan region. And most of our mechanisms in the United States, mechanisms of local government, are very fragmented and localized. They don't fit the landscape of today, whether it's economics or commute sheds or all the other things. And that's why regionalism is such an important antidote to that.
It raises the mysterious question of how much is collaboration how much can you achieve through collaboration, and how much do you need to have the stick behind the door?
That's right. That's right. It's a little bit of both.
The rest of the country looks at your region and says, well, you do have a metro government, and that provides something of authority. But your description today made me say, oh my goodness, they got to deal with all those separate identities as well. Right. So it's you have certain powers, but they're limited, and you have all sorts of other voices and out there. So it's the building of consensus, which is so damn difficult.
Well, I think the key to induce people to be regional thinkers, there's got to be an element of self-interest. And I'm a great believer in self-interest. I mean, it goes back to de Tocqueville, or probably earlier than that nothing wrong with being animated by self-interest, but it's self-interest properly understood, and that we all are better off being part of this larger discussion than if we're trying to do things in isolation. In fact, we can do things better if we do pull together. But it's hit or miss on a variety of issues. You look at what's gone on with water supply, for example, in that example. This region, there's a high degree of territoriality about water supply that just defies any sort of objective capital planning that you would do. I mean, basically have 3 or 4 sources of supply, which is Bull Run, the Coast Range, the Clackamas, and now to some extent the Willamette. And there are investment decisions being made that are really economically irrational, because even though we have those 3 or 4 sources of supply, we have something like 30 or so districts that actually provide facilities and retailers. And so they're caught up in their own identity and institutional interest rather than the interests of maybe the customer or the overall system. So there are areas where we're not good regionalists here at all, and water supply would be one example. There's a lot of fragmentation in other areas as well, in terms of human services, corrections, and things like that, where how jails get run in the metropolitan region, and we haven't touched that on a regional basis either, and I'm not here to volunteer to do so either. Sheriff Justo's in the audience. I know I don't want his job. It's just an example, Bernie.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I guess I'm the alternative transportation guy. It seems to me that alternative transportation is the key to healthy, livable, sustainable, and connected urban areas, including, of course, parks and open spaces. Well, to connect the people with these places, how to fund good, pervasive public transportation?
Is that you want to talk about what's happening elsewhere? Or?
Well, there's no easy answer anywhere on funding good public transportation. The Chicago area, which we've been talking about as making some breakthroughs, had a horrible crisis and almost lost its major parts of its public transportation system just in December. So there's battles everywhere to keep up the adequate funding, and I think we are in a transition in this country from transit as the orphan to transit as a central consideration of how cities and regions run. And this is difficult because it's happening at the same time of immense fiscal stringency and shortages around the country. But unless, to the degree that transition is made, then more rational decisions can be made about how you make the whole system work better, so the long-term profitability and efficiency and service to the public can be tremendous, but it's a very hard battle right now.
Well, I think on the transit side, it's been rather ad hoc in this region. Though we've been fairly successful, it's still ad hoc. And you look at what we're trying to do now with the Milwaukee line, which we really need to get focused on making sure that we do that. But we have good participation, unusually high participation now from the state. We think we're well positioned with regard to the federal government, but there's other bits and pieces of funds that we have at the Metro Council. There's urban renewal and other funds that the City of Portland has. So that's all been very fragmented, and I think we need to be looking for something more comprehensive and ongoing, both on capital but ongoing operations on transit, which is the side of the equation that you asked for. We do have a real disadvantage in this state compared to about 45 others in that a lot of our transportation funds are locked up. They're not flexible in that the gas tax can only be used for roads and highways. But on that side of the equation, frankly, we're, I think at the end game of a 40 or 50 year paradigm in that the instruments on the road side aren't working. They're certainly not sufficient to yield the things that some people want to have built. And I think part of that solution is there's some stuff that people want to have built that ain't going to get built, but there's also going to have to be a change in terms of revenue tools on the road side of the equation as well.
Hi, I'm Cassandra Griffin, City Club member. I also administer the system development charge for the City of Portland Parks Department. So on behalf of all of the customers who had their fees more than double this week, I appreciate the goal of having the best system. People paying permit fees in the City of Portland also had a schools tax added recently. They see green building fees increasing soon. To those customers and for ourselves, how do we decide how much is enough in parks with limited funding?
Well, I know a lot of thought did go into the methodology in terms of how much too much, and the legal requirement I think is actually a good common sense guide as well as the legal requirement, which is what makes it a fee, is that there's a correlation between the service or the capital good being purchased and the fee being paid. So I think that a lot of the work, and there were all kinds of people involved at the City of Portland's Parks Bureau in developing that methodology. My concern would be if there get to be great disparities across the region, whether that creates some distortions, and I think that would be a concern as well.
And there always, this is a general statement, sort of in response. So many things get unconnected. Like if you take a group of a pretty adult audience here, how many of you walked or bicycled to school when you were a kid? The percentage today in this region is what? You probably know.
I don't know.
But in America, it's gone way, way down. It's down around 15, 20% at this point. Well, if you can construct trails and construct roadways and bike boulevards and other ways so kids can do this, and then you think about keeping more neighborhood schools and less mega high schools, which are not very great in their record very many places around this country, of thousands and thousands of kids. You can create a more decentralized system, and suddenly you have one form of transportation, which is a lot of yellow school buses, and the other is lots of soccer moms in their SUVs clogging the highways at key hours of the day. I mean, there's a better world to be built if you can connect a lot of these dots.
Yeah.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. This is a question, very short question for David Bragdon. Toward the end of your presentation, you suggested a map that would chart all the parks in the region, regardless of jurisdiction. Question, when?
We're working on it. It's not that hard. It'll be in the next couple of months. Staff just fainted.
I had to ask a question. This is for David. You painted an eloquent and very vivid description of what the system looks like and might look like in the future. But you described connecting green as more of a process, and this is actually a comment disguised as a question. There is, in fact, a vision document that you, as Metro councilors, adopted a few years ago that is driving that connecting green. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate just a little bit on that, the fact that there is a vision document out there for the bi-state system that describes in very great detail not only what the system would look like, but how the means by which we will get to that, which you articulated quite a bit of in your presentation. But just so folks are aware that there is actually a document underlying that.
Oh, absolutely. There's not only a document, and there's also a working group and a coalition of people. So it is an organization in that sense. What I meant to imply is we're not creating a competing organization. We're trying to bring existing organizations together and provide sort of an umbrella for them, as well as kind of the stated manifesto that all of our organizations, which include your own organization and Trust for Public Land, as well as the local jurisdictions, have been endorsing. So there is reality and substance to it. There's just not a big staff and overhead. It's not a competing organization, was maybe a better way for me to put it.
Steve Shell, member. Question to both of our speakers. I heard connecting green and I heard the stick behind the door. The question is, what does that have to do in terms of our hopes and aspirations? What do both those have to do with our hopes and aspirations for what's going on with the big look, which I think, David, you're deeply involved in? How do you see what we're hoping for out of this process that will yield connecting green or use the stick behind the door?
I'll take that big look part of it, which is just for the benefit of everybody else. This is an effort that's going on at the state level to look at all of Oregon's land use planning systems, and I'm part of a 10-member committee that's doing that. And I think there is some relevance between these two things in that the Oregon system has had a good 35-year history in terms of planning for the future. Has been generally a highly regulatory one. And one of the things that we're looking at are other ways to preserve landscapes in addition to, or in some cases, instead of regulation. The regulation, I think, will always continue to provide a backstop. This is sort of what the stick behind the door comment. Neal's the one who made it. I understand it's a Dutch or is Scandinavian term where whether the regulated party, whether it's the corporate sector or whatever, knows that the government does have the authority to regulate them. And you see, if you saw this Tribune story this morning with regard to the Willamette, there may be an element of that as well, that some people come to the table because they'd rather come to the table than be hit with the stick that's behind the door. I don't know enough of the details, but I think that's sort of the model. The other stick analogy that I've heard lately that I like is a gentleman from Envision Utah who talked to the Big Look Committee, and he said in Utah, which is of course a far more sort of laissez-faire type environment than here, and this is Robert Groh, saying, we use a combination of carrots and sticks, but we also have some orange painted sticks that look like carrots. So. That's Utah. I don't know that we want to emulate Utah. They've built a lot of light rail though.
The political consensus we need in the United States is obviously balance. Barney Frank, who's the chair of the House Banking Committee now, is known as a liberal Democrat, but he says when he speaks to business audiences, he can win them over by saying we need a balance. We need the free market's vigor, and we need occasionally regulation to stop bad things from happening. And of course, the debate is where that balance can occur, and it's both in terms of the free market and in terms of individuals and individual constituencies making decisions that don't match the whole. But the only way I can see to that is having constant, vigorous debate. And then to go back to the financial one, if we'd had more debate about subprime mortgages and what was being just sort of glossed over by the Federal Reserve, we might not be at the brink of a national recession now.